Welcome to Folk Files, a folk music podcast that usually explores the history of folk songs. But this month, we're doing something a little different. At the request of Folk Files listener Andrew, we're going to look at the history of folk instruments. This is a huge topic, so this is more of a survey of the development of certain folk instruments. And this is just part one, all about string instruments, since the episode got way too long. Because most of the songs that I have covered are from English-speaking countries, I have mostly limited myself to instruments that are connected to the folk tradition of the British Isles and the Americas. However, if you want to learn about some other traditional folk instruments from around the world, I'll be writing about them for this month's Patreon blog post. Before we dig in, here are a few words from Basic Folk.
Basic Folk features honest conversations with folk musicians hosted by Cindy Howes and Lizzie No.
Basic Folk approaches these interviews with warmth, with humor, and most importantly, with insightful questions.
Since 2018, this podcast has fostered the folk community and showcased a genre that is often misunderstood.
Has it really been since 2018? Well, no wonder our definition of folk is so extremely broad. We have an entire constellation of guests. And you're going to hear all of these stars sharing their stories, from 3-time Grammy winners like Molly Tuttle.
We had this funny thing we'd say in the studio, like, make us ACUS, so make us Allison Krauss and Union Station, because they're like our heroes.
You're going to hear from modern Haitian American folk legends like Layla McCalla.
I think it's wild how little Haiti is spoken of. It is so much a part of the world that we live in.
And really deep feelers like John Hyatt.
I am going to ask you about your feelings. Hope you're ready.
I'm sorry, I can't go there.
Basic Folk is so pleased to be an official production of the Bluegrass Situation. Thanks for listening, and welcome to Basic Folk.
You could argue that I started the discussion for this episode last month when I discussed the banjo in relation to the roving gambler. As I mentioned, the banjo was invented by enslaved Africans in the American colonies and the Caribbean, and was based on West African instruments. Some say that the most direct ancestor is the akonting, which sounds like this. That akonting was played by Ekona Diatta. One of the earliest records we have of a banjo-type instrument comes from Richard Jobson's diaries from his exploration of the Gambia River in 1620. He mentions an instrument made of a great gourd and a neck. Thereunto was fastened strings. Drums with strings, which is basically what a banjo is, can be traced all the way back to the ancient history of the Far East, Middle East, and Africa. The etymology of the word banjo is contested. It seems like the first time the word was used was in Adrien de Salles' Histoire des Antilles, published in 1678. De Salles discusses an instrument being used in gatherings of enslaved people in Martinique, but the word he uses is banza. Thomas Jefferson also talked about the instrument, but he called it a banjar. These are just two of the many variations of the name, which also include banjil, bangi, and banshaw. Some say that the name comes from a Bantu Kimbundu word, mbanza, which describes a musical instrument, but it was oddly difficult to confirm that. Bantu is a large family of languages, with Bantu Kimbundu just being one of them, and I couldn't find any African sources that confirmed the existence of the word mbanza. But that may not mean much. It could be an archaic word, or it could be that there are just not many digitized sources in Bantu Kimbundu. Another theory about the word banjo seems less likely to me. Some claim that the word comes from bandore, a 16th century instrument in the lute family. The word bandore is derived from the Latin word pandura, which is where mandolin comes from, but we'll get to that later. The standard banjo today has 5 strings, with the highest string partway up the neck. Early banjos did not have that 5th string. I mentioned in the last episode that Joel Walker Sweeney, a white man who performed in minstrel shows, is often credited with popularizing the banjo for white audiences. For a long time, he was called the inventor of the 5-string banjo. However, a painting was discovered called The Old Plantation, which featured a banjo with a fifth string. It was painted prior to 1800, and Joel Walker Sweeney was born in 1810, so he could not have invented the five-string banjo. Judging from the painting and the instrument's general history, the fifth string was most likely invented by an enslaved black musician. Let's now turn our attention to an instrument that's often paired with the banjo, the fiddle. You could argue that the fiddle is the quintessential folk instrument because it is defined by the genre. What I mean is that a fiddle is simply a violin used for playing folk music. There is no physical difference between a fiddle and a violin. The difference relies on the player. An old musical joke says that if you're holding a glass of wine, it's a violin. If you're holding whiskey or beer, it's a fiddle. So why do we have two different words for the same exact instrument? Well, if you go back far enough, it's not two different words. The Roman goddess of joy and victory was called Vitula, from the Latin vitulari, which essentially meant to celebrate. When a stringed instrument meant for joyful celebration was invented, it was given the goddess's name. When the Vitula traveled to Germany, it became fidula, which became fidela in Old English and eventually fiddle. Now, in Spain, the instrument experienced a different etymological journey. Vitula lost its T and became vihuela. Interestingly, the vihuela was and is a guitar, not an early violin, but more on that later. The word was chewed up by the Italian language and became viol. In English, we say viol. Viols were made in many different sizes and were often played sitting down. One variation, played between a player's legs, became known as the viol de gamba, or viol of the legs. Here you can hear it played by the Harper and the Minstrel. But people wanted to be joyous while playing. They wanted to move around. After all, Vitula is all about joy and victory. So Italians started making smaller viols that could be played while dancing. These viols were played mainly on the arm, so they were viol de braccio, viol of the arm. Here's what a viol de braccio may have sounded like. That reconstruction of a viol de braccio was built by luthier Marco Salerno and played by Valentina Nicolai. Valentina plays it under her chin like a normal violin, but they were likely played pressed against the upper arm. In the 1500s, the viola was invented. Shortly afterwards, a smaller version of the viola was invented called the violino. Ino is an Italian diminutive, something you stick at the end of words to indicate small, like bambino. So violino, or violin as it's called in English, is just small viola. There is another Latinate diminutive that's relevant here. Ello also means small. Sometimes it takes the form cello. You might be thinking, that doesn't make sense. A cello isn't a small version of a viola. But it does make sense given that the full name of the cello is violoncello, and violone was the old name for a bass. So cello basically means small upright bass. To recap, violin is the Italian word, and fiddle is the Germanic word. But how did the English language come to use both words for two different styles of playing? It's actually a pattern in English that the older, more Germanic word is considered baser, more common, and less erudite. Think about the Old English ask versus the Latinate inquire, or bug versus insect, or drink versus beverage. In each case, the Latinate word is considered more elevated than the Old English word. The word fiddle became a term of such little importance that it was used as a reference to nonsense in phrases like fiddle-dee-dee or fiddlesticks. So fiddle is for the folk, and violin is for the populace. There are many variations of the fiddle around the world, but I'll touch on one in particular, the Hardanger fiddle from Hardanger in southwest Norway. It's a fiddle that first caught my attention because in Norwegian, it sounds like a member of my family, the Hardingfella. But it's a beautiful instrument with a lot of folklore behind it. This is what it sounds like, played by Ragnhild Hemsing while she walks through the Norwegian countryside. Unlike the standard fiddle, the Hardanger fiddle has 8 strings, 4 of which are resonating strings, meant they aren't played directly, they just enhance the sound. The Hardanger fiddle is specifically meant for dancing, unlike the flatfella, meaning flat fiddle, and vanligfella, common fiddle, that are found throughout the rest of Norway. In many Scandinavian folk tales, the devil is associated with the Hardingfella. During religious revivals, people would often burn fiddles because of this evil association. Also, because fiddles encourage carousing. The Hardanger fiddle was banned from being played in churches until the 20th century. Of course, the devil's connection to the fiddle extends to other cultures. Think, the devil went down to Georgia. But that's a rabbit hole that would take an entire episode to dive into. Now that we've given the fiddle its due, let's turn to its strummed cousin, the mandolin. That was the inimitable Chris Thile playing Jessamyn's reel. A mandolin has the same tuning as a violin, but with doubled strings, so 8 strings tuned to 4 notes. They also follow the same naming conventions. A larger mandolin is a mandola, like viola. An even larger mandolin is a mandocello. But, to my knowledge, a mandocello doesn't mean small mandone. I don't actually think the word mandone exists. So it just means cello-sized mandolin, losing the original diminutive definition. The history of the mandolin starts with the mandora, or mandore, a small, pear-shaped lute from the 16th century. It is said to be descended from the rebec, which was bowed and sounds something like this, here played by an artist named RAVN. It is also related to the medieval gittern, a strummed instrument that sounded like this. That was Edward Foster playing Je nous en prie. The word mandora comes from the Latin pandora, which referred to a 3-stringed instrument. Despite this, the mandora originally had 4 or 5 strings. Thanks to the influence of the lute, it grew to have 8 to 12 strings in double courses, frets, and a tension bridge, similar to modern mandolins. The first truly recognizable mandolin, however, wasn't invented until the 19th century by a man named Pasquale Vinaccia in Naples. In the late 19th century, America experienced a substantial wave of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, and with these immigrants came the mandolin. The instrument became very popular in vaudeville performances. Bernardo de Pace was a particularly famous vaudevillian performer known as the Wizard of the Mandolin. Here's a little bit of one of his performances. In the early 1900s, Orville Gibson, as in Gibson Guitars, patented the flat-backed mandolin, which is what most people play today. He invented the flat back because he thought that the gourd-shaped ones were ugly, referring to them as potato bugs. Some people believe that the mandolins that Gibson made between 1904 and 1924 are the best ones that have ever been crafted. But let's now turn to the instrument that Gibson is currently synonymous with, the guitar. The word guitar comes from the ancient Greek instrument, the kithara. According to myth, Hermes made the first kithara from a tortoise shell, which acted as a resonator. That resonator is what set the chitarra apart from the lyre. Musicians would play the chitarra with a plectrum, which became the modern pick, and they would use their hands to dampen the strings. It was held similarly to a guitar, and it even sometimes had a shoulder strap. While that's the origin of the name, it's not the origin of the instrument itself, which is likely older than written history. Musical scholars have traced the history of the guitar through both the oud and the lute. The first picture of a lute-like instrument dates to around 3500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. As for the oud, there is an incredibly disturbing biblical myth about its creation. As the story goes, Lamech, Noah's grandfather, hung the body of his dead son in a tree to dry after he accidentally killed him. The shape of his son's bleached skeleton inspired him to invent the oud. Ugh. But ouds and lutes are both shaped differently than modern-day guitars. It wasn't until the 15th and 16th century that Spanish musicians began playing instruments with the familiar curved shape that we know today. Here is Rolf Lislevand playing the only surviving playable Stradivarius guitar, made in 1679, so you can get an idea of how the earliest guitars sounded. These early guitars were smaller and had 5 strings or courses of strings and movable frets. At least in Spain, they also tended to have a curved back. Versions of the curved back guitar have survived in modern mariachi music. I mentioned vihuela when talking about the etymology of violin. That is still the word for the traditional guitar used in mariachi bands, which sounds like this. Antonio de Torres Jurado is said to be the inventor of the modern guitar. In the mid-1800s, he created the model we know with 6 strings, a broad body, and tuning pegs. Those first modern guitars, however, still had strings made of catgut. For years, I thought that catgut meant the intestines of a cat. It's not. Catgut is usually made of the intestines of a sheep. The use of animal intestines in musical instruments goes back at least 6,000 years, according to hieroglyphics. The intestines were stretched, dried, and twisted, which gave them a resonant tone. When it comes to instrument strings, you have to think about both mass and flexibility. If the strings don't have enough mass, they won't create enough sound. If there's not enough flexibility, you won't be able to keep them in tune. So why is it called catgut? It goes back to the etymology of guitar. It was originally kitgut. Kit is a short version of chitarra and was used to describe a small fiddle used by dancing teachers in the 16th century. I know, it's confusing. The word violin is related to vihuela, which is a guitar, and the word guitar is related to kit, which is a violin. After World War II, metal strings, originally invented in Connecticut in the 1850s, became more common, made of silver, copper wire, steel, or aluminum. Modern violin strings are usually made of synthetic materials wound with metal. When talking about the use of guitars in folk music, specifically in American folk music, we can't neglect the slide guitar or dobro. Blues-style slide guitar can be traced to an instrument called the diddley bow, which was created by enslaved people in the American South. The diddley bow, sometimes called the one-string or jitterbug, is composed of one wire stretched between 2 nails on a glass bottle. It was based on string instruments in Africa and was often used as a beginner instrument or toy for enslaved children. It sounded like this, here played by Justin Johnson. I recently saw the movie Sinners, and first of all, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it for anyone with an interest in folk music and its history. I'm not going to give away any spoilers, and I encourage going in blind, but there is a scene that visualizes how the blues slide guitar of the early 20th century is linked to instruments from West Africa and more modern guitar styles used in funk, rock, pop, and hip-hop. Here's a little bit of slide guitar from the soundtrack of Sinners. At the same time as the blues-style slide guitar was being developed, a similar tradition arose in Hawaii. In the 19th century, Hawaiians began using a sliding technique on steel guitars that they sat in their laps with the strings pointing up. You'll probably recognize the sound, which became popular on the mainland, especially thanks to Hawaiian artists like Sol Hupi. The instrument is now often called a dobro. It's a word like Band-Aid, where a brand of something became synonymous with the thing itself. In the early 1900s, the Dopiera brothers started a steel guitar company called Dobro, which was formed from a word meaning goodness in Slovak and their own last name. Let's move on to another category of string instrument, the dulcimer. There are two major types of dulcimers most commonly used in folk music, the hammered dulcimer and the instrument known as the mountain, Appalachian, or lap dulcimer. These two dulcimers are completely unrelated evolutionarily, even though they have the same name, which comes from dulce, meaning sweet, and melos, meaning tune, like melody. While the Appalachian dulcimer has only been in its current form for about 200 years, the hammered dulcimer is ancient. It's likely Middle Eastern or Near Eastern in origin and has been played for about 5,000 years. You can also find versions of the hammered dulcimer that go by different names in many countries, including Greece, India, and China. The hammered dulcimer became popular in the 18th and 19th centuries in America, though it was sometimes called interesting names like the lumberjack's piano or whamadiddle. The dulcimer is more portable than the piano, an instrument that is said to be descended from the hammered dulcimer, which is why it found favor during a time in American history when people were on the move, whether that was because of immigration, westward expansion, or other reasons. Here's a little taste of the hammered dulcimer, played by the Lady Victoria. The mountain dulcimer is probably Scandinavian or Germanic in origin. It is derived from lap zithers, and the Scheitholz might be its most direct relative. Here's a little bit of O zu lieber Augustin, performed on the Scheitholz at the Frontier Culture Museum in Virginia. The instrument came to Pennsylvania with German immigrants, traveled to the Appalachian Mountains, and eventually got a larger sound box. When the instrument hit West Virginia and Kentucky, it was put on an hourglass body. Here's the result, the modern lap dulcimer, played by Joni Mitchell at the start of a live performance of California. I'm going to cover one final instrument in this episode of Folk Files, the hurdy-gurdy. It's not a very common one, but it was a frequently requested one when I asked the Folk Files community which instruments I should cover. It's also my favorite instrument, so I was happy to oblige. In terms of structure, the hurdy-gurdy is essentially a fiddle that's played with a rosined wheel instead of a bow. Also, the melody is played using keys rather than placing your fingers directly on the strings. Like the hardanger fiddle, there are drone strings. There's also something called the dog string, or trompette, which produces a buzzing sound that allows players to create a beat to accompany the melody. Listen to this example from Scott Marshall, where the dog string creates a jaunty dance rhythm. The hurdy-gurdy is old. Its origins are unknown, but it may have been originally a Moorish instrument that was brought to Spain in the 8th century. You can see depictions of the instrument in a codex containing the Cantigas de Santa Maria and in Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. It was first mentioned in a 10th century text under the name organistrum. The organistrum was larger than the modern hurdy-gurdy and was also a different shape. It looked more like a sitar or nyckelharpa, like a figure 8 attached to a rectangular extension. It required 2 people to operate, one to man the keys and one to turn the crank. This is the sound of a reconstructed organistrum played in the church of Santa Maria de Albarracin in Spain. By the 13th century, a smaller version of the organistrum became popular called the symphonia. In France, what we now know as the hurdy-gurdy was called vieille à roue, or wheel fiddle. It's been associated with both the lowest and highest echelons of society. It was especially popular in court in the late 17th century during the reign of Louis XIV. But in the 19th century, it had a reputation as a beggar's instrument. Don't get confused like me. Even though it has a crank, hurdy-gurdies are not associated with monkeys. That's the street organ. The term hurdy-gurdy came about in the mid-18th century and is thought to be an onomatopoeia. It was originally hurly-burly, and it was a slightly derogatory name for the instrument. Despite the fact that it didn't have the best reputation, it was a primary feature of Parisian music sessions in the 19th century. These sessions were French peasants' answer to homesickness. They had left their homes in the country, but they would gather in wine shops, sitting on barrels and benches, and play familiar folk tunes on the hurdy-gurdy and the cabaret, a form of French bagpipes. However, in about 1880, a nemesis for the hurdy-gurdy came along, and the hurdy-gurdy slowly started to become obsolete at the French sessions. That nemesis? The accordion. I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger, and I'll start next month's episode by discussing the history of the accordion and explaining why it was able to beat the hurdy-gurdy in the Parisian popularity contest. That episode will also discuss bagpipes, woodwinds, and a bunch of percussion instruments. If you have any questions or corrections, or if you just want to geek out about folk stuff, send me a message at folkfilespodcast@gmail.com, or find me on social media. Thank you so much for listening.